What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object in the gilded cage of New York's elite? Damian Blackwood was the force, a billionaire whose temper was as legendary as his fortune. He could buy anything, crush anyone. Elara Vance was the object, a waitress invisible, just trying to survive another shift. One night, a careless gesture, a cascade of crimson wine, worth more than her apartment, becomes the catalyst. But her response isn't tears or anger. It's a quiet, devastating countermove that pierces his armor of wealth and arrogance, setting in motion a chain of events that will unravel a dark secret, connecting them both, and prove that true power isn't measured in dollars, but in dignity. The air in Arya, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, was thick with the scent of old money and new ambition. It was a place where conversations were conducted in hushed, confident tones, and a dropped fork clattered with the significance of a guillotine. For Elara Vance, it was simply Tuesday. Another 12-hour shift on her feet, another night of balancing overpriced plates and placating egos, all while the image of her younger brother Liam, pale in his hospital bed, remained seared onto the back of her eyelids. The job was a lifeline. The tips paid for the experimental medications his insurance deemed non-essential. So she smiled. She smiled when a hedge fund manager's wife complained her water wasn't crisp enough. She smiled when a tech mogul snapped his fingers at her, as if summoning a dog. She smiled because each strained curl of her lips was another dollar toward Liam's next breath. Tonight's most challenging table was Damian Blackwood. He wasn't just wealthy, he was a titan, a predator of the financial world whose firm, Blackwood Capital, was infamous for hostile takeovers that left entire towns jobless. He sat alone, radiating an aura of profound impatience, his sharp jawline and storm-grey eyes scanning the room as if assessing everything for its acquisition value. He had dismissed the sommelier with a flick of his wrist and ordered a 1982 Chateau Margaux, a bottle that cost more than Elara's annual salary. She approached the table with the practiced grace of a dancer, the $1,000 bottle held with the reverence of a holy relic. "Mr. Blackwood, your Margaux," she said, her voice a soft, professional murmur. He didn't look at her. His attention was fixed on his phone, his thumb swiping aggressively. "Open it," he commanded, the words clipped and devoid of any courtesy. Elara's hands were steady as she expertly cut the foil and eased the cork from the bottle with a barely audible sigh. This was the ritual. The presentation of the cork, the careful pour for the tasting. She angled the bottle to pour a small measure into his glass. It was then that his phone buzzed violently. A deal closing a market, shifting whatever it was. It caused him to jolt, gesturing dismissively with his hand without looking up. "Just pour the damned thing, I don't have all night." His hand, a blur of motion, collided with hers. Time seemed to slow. The bottle tipped a graceful arc of deep, ruby-red liquid erupting from its neck. It wasn't a splash. It was a deluge. The priceless wine cascaded down the pristine white linen of Elara's uniform, soaking her apron, her blouse, and splashing onto the pale grey suede of her worn-out shoes. It felt shockingly cold against her skin. The dining room fell silent. The clatter of forks ceased. Every eye turned to their table. The wine, the colour of blood, spread across her chest like a mortal wound. Damian Blackwood finally looked up from his phone, his eyes registering the scene not with alarm or apology, but with pure, unadulterated annoyance. "For God's sake!" He snarled, his voice a low growl that cut through the silence. He looked at the mess on her, then at the nearly empty bottle in her hand. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? That was a $12,000 bottle of wine, you clumsy little—" He stopped, but the insult hung in the air. Elara stood frozen, the cold of the wine seeping into her skin. but a different kind of fire was igniting in her chest. She could feel the stares of the other patrons, the pity, the schadenfreude. She saw her manager, Jean-Pierre, rushing over his face, a mask of horror. This was it. The end of the job. The end of the lifeline. Something inside her snapped, not with a bang, but with a quiet, steely click. She wasn't just a waitress. She was Elara Vance. She was the daughter of an architect who taught her that structure and dignity were everything. She was the sister of a boy who fought for every day with more courage than this man had in his entire being. She calmly placed the bottle back on the table. She looked Damian Blackwood directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. The room held its breath, expecting tears, a panicked apology, or a fiery retort. She offered none of them. Instead, in a clear, calm voice that carried through the silent room, she spoke. First in flawless Parisian French. "An involuntary gesture, sir, but the error is yours. Haste is the enemy of elegance." A flicker of surprise crossed Damian's face. He understood French perfectly. Before he could process it, she switched back to English, her voice now laced with a cool precision that was more unnerving than any shout. The 1982 Margot is known for its complex bouquet of black currants violets and a hint of truffle. A shame to waste it, however. She continued, her eyes holding his. Its true value, like that of any asset, is only realized through proper handling. You treat a rare vintage with the same crude impatience you apply to your corporate raids, Mr. Blackwood. You see the price, but you have absolutely no concept of its worth. She wasn't finished. She straightened her posture, ignoring the sticky dampness of her uniform. There's a saying by the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. You might appreciate, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. You reacted with anger at the loss of a commodity. I am reacting to the loss of my employment, which is infinitely more valuable. I hope your evening improves. With that, she untied her wine-stained apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the corner of the table. She gave a slight formal nod to her horrified manager, turned her back on the stunned billionaire, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a silence so profound you could hear a stock market crash. Damian Blackwood was a man unaccustomed to silence, especially a silence he hadn't orchestrated. As Elara Vance walked away, her back straight and her head held high, he felt an unfamiliar sensation. He had been dismissed. Not by a rival CEO or a board of directors, but by a waitress who spoke perfect French, who could identify the tasting notes of his wine after it was spilled all over her, and who quoted Greek philosophy as a parting shot. His initial fury curdled into a strange, unsettling cocktail of indignation and intrigue. The entire restaurant was staring. He could feel their judgment, their whispers. For the first time in a decade, Damian Blackwood was not in control of the narrative. He had been publicly checked, and not with a lawsuit or a corporate maneuver, but with a quiet display of intellectual and moral superiority that left him feeling strangely small. "Sir, I am so sorry, Jean-Pierre," the manager stammered, rushing to the table. "She will be dealt with. Fired, of course. We will compensate you for the wine, for the disturbance." "Leave it," Damian said, his voice flat. He threw his black credit card on the table. "Charge me for the bottle and the dinner I didn't have, and find out her full name." "Her name?" Jean-Pierre asked, confused. "Sir, I assure you she will never work in this city again." "I don't care about that," Damian cut him off, his grey eyes like chips of granite. "I want her name. Now." Meanwhile, Elara walked through the brisk Manhattan night, the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly giving way to a cold, creeping dread. The damp patch on her blouse felt like ice. She had stood up for herself. Yes, but at what cost? That job with its high-end clientele was a unicorn. The tips she made in one weekend there were more than a month's salary anywhere else. Her apartment was a small third-floor walk-up in a less fashionable part of the city, but it was clean and filled with books on architecture and design remnants of a life she once thought she would have. On a small table next to a worn-out couch was a framed photo of her and a smiling, healthy-looking teenage boy. Liam. She changed out of her ruined clothes, scrubbing at her skin as if to wash away the humiliation and the cloying scent of wine. Then she sat down and opened her laptop, her face illuminated by the cold glow of the screen. She pulled up her budget spreadsheet. Rows and columns of stark numbers stared back at her. Liam's upcoming specialist consultation, the copay for his medication, the rent. With the loss of her job, the carefully balanced equation was now a cascade of red. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, washed over her. What had she done? Her moment of defiance, her satisfying intellectual jab at a man who deserved it, now felt like a foolish, selfish indulgence. Dignity didn't pay for hospital bills. The next 2 days were a blur of fruitless job hunting. Overqualified was the feedback from diners and cafes. We're not hiring was the refrain from other high-end establishments. Word of the incident at Arya had clearly spread through the city's tight-knit hospitality network. She was blacklisted. The name Damian Blackwood was a brand, and she had dared to tarnish it. On the third morning, as she was nursing a cup of cheap coffee and trying to figure out which of her father's old architecture books she could sell, a knock echoed on her door. It was sharp official, not the friendly tap of a neighbor. Her heart pounded. Was it the landlord? Had Arya sent a bill? She opened the door a crack to see a man in a perfectly tailored dark suit. He was holding a sleek black tablet. Elara Vance. He asked, his tone polite but impersonal. Yes, my name is Thomas. I'm from Mr. Blackwood's office. Elara's blood ran cold. This was it. A lawsuit. A cease and desist. Public humiliation was not enough for a man like him. I'm here to deliver a message. The man continued, unfazed by her silence. He tapped on his tablet, and a car, a black Audi, with tinted windows, pulled up silently to the curb below. Mr. Blackwood requests your presence at the Blackwood Capital Headquarters. Now. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. And why would I possibly want to do that? Elara asked, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. The man Thomas looked at her with an expression that was neither kind nor cruel, but simply factual. Mr. Blackwood is not a man who offers second chances, or for that matter, first ones. He has made an exception. He instructed me to tell you this concerns a proposition, not a reprimand, and that it would be financially advantageous. Financially advantageous. The words hung in the air, a blatant, cynical lure. He knew. Of course he knew. A man like that wouldn't just find out her name. He would have a full dossier on her by now. He would know about her financial struggles, about Liam. He was dangling the one thing he knew she couldn't afford to refuse. Rage warred with desperation inside her. He was trying to prove his point that everyone, even the stoic quoting Waitress, had a price. And the most infuriating part was he might be right. Fine, she said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. I'll go. As she was escorted to the waiting car, Elara felt a profound sense of dread. She was walking willingly into the lion's den, armed with nothing but the same dignity that had gotten her into this mess in the first place. She had no idea what kind of twisted game Damian Blackwood was planning, but she knew one thing for certain: it wasn't about spilled wine anymore. The Blackwood Capitol building was a shard of smoked glass and obsidian steel that pierced the New York skyline, a monument to ruthless ambition. The lobby was a cavern of Italian marble and chilling silence, where the only sound was the hushed tapping of keyboards from a reception desk that looked like a modern art installation. Elara, in her most professional and only blazer, felt utterly out of place. Every person she passed wore their wealth like a second skin, perfectly tailored suits, watches that cost more than cars, an air of effortless superiority. She was escorted directly to a private elevator that ascended with stomach-lurching speed. The doors opened, not into a hallway, but directly into Damian Blackwood's office. The room was less an office and more a kingdom. 3 of the 4 walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a godlike panoramic view of the city below. The 4th wall was lined with what looked like first-edition books, their leather spines perfectly uniform. The desk was a massive slab of polished mahogany, empty except for a single sleek laptop. And behind it, silhouetted against the sprawling cityscape, was Damian Blackwood. He didn't rise. He simply watched her approach, his grey eyes, appraising her, stripping away her composure layer by layer. The power dynamic he had lost in the restaurant was now firmly, overwhelmingly re-established. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the sound in the room. "Thank you for coming." "You didn't leave me much of a choice," she replied, refusing to let her voice tremble. She stopped a respectful but defiant distance from his desk. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Everyone has a choice. They just don't always like the options. Please sit." He gestured to a single stark leather chair that felt more like an interrogation seat than a visitor's chair. She remained standing. "I'd prefer to hear what you have to say first." His eyes narrowed slightly. He respected the defiance, even as it annoyed him. "Very well. Your file." He gestured to his laptop. "Elara Vance, 27 years old, top of your class at Columbia dual major in architecture and art history, dropped out 6 months before graduation. A series of unremarkable jobs since, currently unemployed. Your younger brother Liam has dilated cardiomyopathy and is on the waiting list for a heart transplant at New York Presbyterian." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. It was one thing to know he would investigate her. It was another to hear the most painful, private details of her life, recited like a stock portfolio summary. "Was that meant to intimidate me?" she asked, her voice colder than she felt. "It was meant to establish a baseline of fact," he retorted smoothly. "To demonstrate that I understand your motivations. You are intelligent, educated, and desperate. A potent combination." He finally stood up and walked around the desk, his movements fluid and predatory. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could feel the intimidating energy radiating from him. "You embarrassed me, Miss Vance. In my world, people who do that typically disappear. They lose their jobs, their apartments, their futures. But you did it with a certain style. You didn't wail or cry. You weaponized dignity. It was inefficient, but effective." "What do you want, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, cutting through his analysis. "I want to offer you a job," he said plainly. Elara stared at him, bewildered. "A job doing what, waiting tables at your next board meeting?" "No," he said, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "I have a project, a special project off the books from my usual acquisitions. It requires discretion, a keen eye for detail, and the ability to handle difficult personalities. Namely, mine. Your performance at the restaurant, while costly, was an impressive interview. You are unflappable." He turned and walked towards one of the windows looking down at the city. "The world sees me as a destroyer, a liquidator. It's a useful reputation, but one that needs occasional polishing. I am funding the construction of a new pediatric care wing at St. Jude's Hospital, the Blackwood Pavilion. Elara was stunned into silence. A children's hospital wing. It seemed so utterly incongruous with the man standing before her. It had to be a PR stunt, a tax write-off, a way to whitewash a reputation stained by corporate greed. My architects and project managers are the best in the business, he continued. They are efficient, ruthless, and they deliver on time and under budget. But they lack a certain perspective, a human element. They design a building, a sterile box to house sick children. I need someone on the inside of the project, someone who can look at the blueprints, at the materials, at the flow of the space, and see it through a different lens, through the eyes of a family member who might spend weeks or months living in those halls. He turned back to face her. I need you to be my consultant, my liaison. You will review the plans, challenge the designers, question the process. You will report only to me. Your background in architecture makes you qualified. Your personal situation, he said the words carefully chosen, makes you invaluable. He was offering her a chance to use the skills from the life she'd been forced to abandon. He was offering her a way to channel her pain and fear for Liam into something productive, and he was offering to pay her for it. The salary will be $250,000 for the 6-month project term, he stated, watching her reaction, along with a signing bonus effective immediately that I believe will be sufficient to cover any outstanding medical consultations and ensure your brother receives the best possible preliminary care wherever you see fit. It was a blatant, perfectly calculated bribe. He wasn't just offering her a job, he was offering her Liam's health. He was twisting her love for her brother into a golden leash. He was proving his point. Everything and everyone had a price. Elara felt a wave of nausea. To accept this would be to capitulate to his cynical worldview. It would mean working for the kind of man who had likely destroyed countless families like hers on his climb to the top. But then an image of Liam flashed in her mind, his labored breathing, his quiet courage. And another thought surfaced, sharp and clear. What if this wasn't a surrender? What if it was an infiltration? She could take his money, yes, but she could also genuinely influence this project. She could ensure that this monument to his ego actually became a place of healing and comfort for children like Liam. She could fight for every detail, every window with a view, every waiting room that didn't feel like a prison. She could use his cynical PR stunt to create something genuinely good. She looked him in the eye, the fire from the restaurant returning to her gaze. I have conditions, she said. Damian raised an eyebrow, intrigued. First, my title will be Project Oversight Consultant, not Liaison. Second, I will have full access to all plans, contractors, and meetings. No information will be withheld. Third, while I report to you, my recommendations will be submitted in writing and must be formally addressed, not casually dismissed. And fourth, she took a breath, you will never ever mention my brother's health as a point of leverage again. It is the context for my expertise, not a button for you to push. Damian Blackwood stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching. He had expected her to gratefully accept, perhaps with a few tears. He had not expected a negotiation. He had not expected her to set terms. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was a rare, startling sight. Welcome to Blackwood Capital, Miss Vance, he said, extending his hand. I believe this is going to be a very interesting 6 months. Elara shook his hand. It was firm cold and felt unnervingly like a deal with the devil. The 48th floor of Blackwood Capital was a sterile landscape of grey, white, and chrome. It was the domain of the mergers and acquisitions teams the corporate raiders Damian employed to dismantle companies. It was also where Elara was given a glass-walled office, a space designed for observation, not privacy. It was a clear message: you are here, but you are not one of us. Her first week was a trial by fire. She was introduced to the project lead, Marcus Thorne, a man who seemed to have been chiseled from the same granite as Damian's ambition. Thorne was Damian's longest-serving executive, a fiercely loyal pit bull with a law degree from Yale and the predatory instincts of a shark. He viewed Elara with unconcealed disdain, seeing her not as a consultant, but as the boss's inexplicable, unqualified pet project. "The architectural plans," Marcus said, dropping a thick, heavy roll of blueprints onto her desk with a thud. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Blackwood insisted you review them personally. They've already been approved by the hospital board and the City Planning Commission, of course, a formality." For the next 3 days, Elara immersed herself in those plans. She didn't just read them, she inhabited them. She taped them to the glass walls of her office, tracing the lines with her fingers, picturing the hallways, the patient rooms, the waiting areas. The design by a top-tier architectural firm was a model of efficiency. It was clean, modern, and clinically precise. It maximized bed capacity, optimized nursing station placement, and minimized construction costs. It was also completely soul-crushing. The patient rooms were uniform boxes with small, high windows. The family waiting areas were cramped, windowless spaces with back-to-back chairs. The corridors were long, straight, and monotonous, painted in a shade of beige that seemed scientifically engineered to induce despair. It was a building designed for treating diseases, not for healing children. She remembered the countless hours she had spent with Liam in hospitals. She remembered the suffocating feeling of rooms without sunlight, the exhaustion of trying to sleep in a rigid chair, the desperate need for a quiet corner to cry or a small patch of green to see. This design had none of that. It was a monument to Damian Blackwood's efficiency, not a sanctuary for frightened families. Armed with a stack of notes and a surge of purpose, she requested a meeting with Damian and Marcus. They met in a conference room that felt like the inside of a supercomputer. Damian sat at the head of a vast black table, Marcus at his right hand. "Well, Miss Vance," Damian began, his tone impatient, "are you impressed?" "It's a remarkable piece of engineering, Mr. Blackwood." Elara started her voice, calm and even. "It will be built on time and on budget. Medically, it is state-of-the-art." Marcus Thorne smirked. "Of course, we hired the best." However, Elara continued ignoring him and looking directly at Damian. "As a place for human beings, particularly small, sick human beings, and their terrified parents, it is a catastrophic failure." The smirk vanished from Marcus's face. Damian's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes sharpened with focus. "Explain," he commanded. Elara stood and walked to a large monitor at the end of the room, plugging in her tablet. She brought up the floor plan. "Let's start with the oncology ward," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The rooms face north. They will get almost no direct sunlight. Studies have shown that natural light can decrease recovery times and reduce depression in patients. We need to flip the entire wing to face south, even if it complicates the HVAC layout." She switched the slide. "The family lounge. It's an interior room with no windows. It's where parents will get the worst news of their lives. It needs to be a place of solace, not a closet. It should be on the corner of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the park. We should have comfortable seating, private alcoves, a kitchenette. That would require a complete structural redesign, and add millions to the budget. Marcus interjected, his voice dripping with scorn. This isn't a luxury hotel. For the families who will live there for months on end, it might as well be, Elara countered without missing a beat. Next, the corridors. They are long and sterile. Imagine being a 5-year-old just diagnosed with leukemia, being wheeled down this hallway. It's terrifying. She brought up a series of 3D renderings she had worked on all night. The sterile hallways were now broken up with colorful art installations at a child's eye level. The ceilings had projections of stars and clouds. There were curved walls and reading nooks carved into the space. We create destinations, not just corridors, she explained passionately. We use color theory to create zones that are calming or stimulating. We build a rooftop garden, a therapeutic space where a child in a wheelchair can feel the sun and touch a plant. She presented for 20 minutes, deconstructing the soulless efficiency of the plans and rebuilding them with empathy. She talked about the acoustics in the neonatal intensive care unit, the importance of fold-out beds for parents that were actually comfortable, the need for a dedicated space for teenage patients who felt too old for cartoons and too young to be in an adult ward. When she finished, the room was silent. Marcus Thorne looked apoplectic, his face flushed with anger at having his vetted, approved plans torn apart by a former waitress. Elara braced herself for Damian's reaction. She expected him to dismiss her ideas as sentimental, expensive nonsense. She expected him to agree with Marcus to put her back in her place. Damian stared at the screen at her sketch of a child's room with a large bay window, a window seat where a parent could sit and watch their child sleep. He was silent for a full minute. Elara could see a muscle working in his jaw. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet. How much would these changes cost? He asked, his question directed not at Elara, but at Marcus. Marcus sputtered. Sir, it's not just the cost. It would set the timeline back by months. We'd have to refile permits, renegotiate with the contractors. I didn't ask about the timeline. Damian cut him off, his voice lethally soft. I asked how much. Substantially more, Marcus bit out. 15, maybe 20% over budget. Damian nodded slowly. He looked from his furious right-hand man to the determined young woman who stood her ground. He looked at the plans, then back at Elara. Do it, he said. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. Damian, I said do it. Damian repeated, his voice now steel. Get the architects back in here. I want to see revised plans on my desk by Monday, incorporating Miss Vance's notes. All of them. He stood up, his gaze fixed on Elara. For the first time, she saw something other than arrogance or intrigue in his eyes. It was a flicker of grudging respect. It seems, Miss Vance, he said, that I may be getting my money's worth after all. As he swept out of the room, leaving Marcus Thorne glaring at her with pure hatred, Elara allowed herself a small internal sigh of relief. She had won the first battle. But she knew, looking at the venom in Marcus's eyes, that the war for the soul of the Blackwood Pavilion had only just begun. And she had made a very powerful enemy. The victory in the conference room was a turning point. Damian Blackwood, a man who worshipped the bottom line, had greenlit a multi-million-dollar budget increase based on principles of empathy and human-centric design. The architects, initially resistant, were now grudgingly working with Elara, their professional pride piqued by her insightful, well-researched critiques. She was no longer just the boss's strange hire. She was a genuine force on the project. But Marcus Thorne's hostility intensified. He saw Elara as a threat, an emotional variable in Damian's ruthlessly logical world. He began a campaign of subtle sabotage. Meeting invitations were accidentally lost. Crucial contractor emails were miscatalogued. He would challenge her on every point in meetings, attempting to frame her compassionate suggestions as fiscally irresponsible whims. Elara, however, was meticulous. She triple-checked every calendar invite and created her own communication channels with the architects and builders. She countered Marcus's financial arguments with data presenting studies that proved better patient environments led to faster recoveries, reducing long-term costs for the hospital. She was winning, and Marcus knew it. One evening, working late in her glass office, Elara was digging through the project's digital archives, looking for old soil analysis reports for the proposed rooftop garden. The server was a labyrinth of Blackwood Capital's past projects, a digital graveyard of acquired companies and liquidated assets. As she navigated the complex file structure, a folder name caught her eye: Project Mahantasha Phoenix's Tower Archive. A jolt went through her cold and sharp. The Phoenix Tower. It had been her father's magnum opus. Arthur Vance was a brilliant, idealistic architect who believed buildings should serve communities, not just developers. The Phoenix Tower was his dream, a mixed-use, residential and commercial building in a struggling neighborhood, designed with subsidized housing, green spaces, and community centers. It was meant to be a symbol of urban renewal. He had poured his soul and his life savings into the project. But just as they were breaking ground, the primary investor was bought out in a swift, brutal, hostile takeover. The new parent company saw no value in community centers or subsidized housing. They gutted the project, stripped it for its real estate assets, and sold off the land to a developer who built luxury condos. The dream died. Her father bankrupted, and heartbroken suffered a massive stroke a year later and never fully recovered. His death shortly after was what had forced Elara to drop out of Columbia and take any job she could find to support herself and Liam. Her hand trembled as she clicked on the folder. Inside were subfolders, financial reports, legal documents, and one folder labeled Acquisition Lead. She opened it. The screen displayed a single name, Blackwood Capital. The air left her lungs. It couldn't be. She scrolled frantically through the documents, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found the final liquidation report, the document that officially killed her father's dream. At the bottom of the page were two signatures. The first was Marcus Thorne. The second, authorizing the entire action, was Damian Blackwood. The room began to spin. The man who had hired her, the man whose project she was pouring her heart into, was the same man who had destroyed her father and shattered her family. This wasn't a random act of fate. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a cruel, cosmic joke. Her job, the money that was paying for Liam's care, was blood money. It was profit squeezed from the wreckage of her own past. A wave of revulsion and fury washed over her. She wanted to storm into Damian's office, to throw the truth in his face, to scream at him for what he had done. She wanted to quit, to walk away from his tainted money and never look back. But then she thought of Liam. She thought of the rooftop garden she had fought for, the sunlit rooms, the family lounges. The project had become more than just a job. It was a chance to build something her father would have been proud of, a chance to create a legacy of healing on the foundation of her family's pain. It was a chance for redemption, not for Damian, but for her father's vision. Quitting would be the easy way out. It would satisfy her anger, but it would accomplish nothing. Liam would lose his funding. The hospital wing would revert to Marcus's cold, sterile box. Damian Blackwood would move on, forgetting her as easily as he forgot the countless lives he'd upended on his way to the top. But staying was a different kind of power. She could stay and see this through. She could embed her father's ideals so deeply into the DNA of the building that they could never be stripped out. She could use Damian Blackwood's own resources to build a monument to everything he wasn't. It was a dangerous, painful path, laden with the bitter irony of her situation. She would have to face him every day, knowing he was the architect of her family's ruin. She would have to smile and collaborate with the man who had signed her father's professional death warrant. Elara leaned back in her chair, the cold glass of her office wall pressing against her. The city lights blurred through the tears welling in her eyes. The battle for the Blackwood Pavilion had just become deeply, agonizingly personal. She wasn't just fighting for sick children anymore. She was fighting for the ghost of Arthur Vance. The discovery changed everything. Every meeting, every conversation with Damian Blackwood was now freighted with a heavy, unspoken truth. Elara looked at him and saw not just a ruthless billionaire, but the man who had unknowingly set her life on its tragic course. The work became her armor. She poured every ounce of her energy and grief into the project, her focus becoming razor-sharp, her determination unyielding. Her design changes were no longer just suggestions. They were non-negotiable principles. She fought for sustainable building materials, for art therapy rooms, for a dedicated library, with a storyteller-in-residence program. She was relentless, her quiet passion often leaving the seasoned executives in the room speechless. She was building her father's heart into the hospital's steel skeleton. Damian, unaware of the reason for her intensified drive, was both impressed and bewildered by her. He had hired a consultant. He had ended up with a crusader. He found himself looking forward to their daily briefings, to the way she could dismantle a cost-benefit analysis with a simple human story. She was changing the project, but she was also imperceptibly changing him. One afternoon he found her in the model room, staring at a miniature version of the completed hospital wing. "It's a building, Miss Vance," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Don't look so grim." "My father always said a building isn't just wood and steel," she replied, not turning to look at him. "It's a container for human experience. It can either crush the spirit or lift it up. Your father was an architect," Damian asked, a note of genuine curiosity in his voice. Elara's heart seized. "He was," she said, choosing her words carefully. "He had a vision for what architecture could do for people. He wasn't much of a businessman, though. He believed in people more than profit margins." The words were a subtle indictment, a test she knew he wouldn't even recognize. "The world is run by profit margins, not visionaries," Damian said, the familiar cynicism returning to his tone. But it sounded more like a well-worn habit than a conviction. He looked at the model at the tiny rooftop garden she had designed. "Tell me about your brother." The abrupt change of subject caught her off guard. "What about him?" "How is he?" It was the first time he had ever asked. It was a simple question, but coming from him, it felt like a seismic shift. "He's stable," she said, her guard still up. "We're hoping he gets stronger before a transplant becomes critical. He's a fighter." "Good," Damian said simply, and then he left. The brief exchange left Elara reeling. Was it possible he was capable of genuine concern, or was it just another calculated tactic, another way to manage his asset? The uncertainty was exhausting. Meanwhile, Marcus Thorne was growing desperate. Elara's influence over Damian was becoming undeniable. The Blackwood Pavilion was now being lauded in preliminary press releases for its innovative, patient-focused design. And all the credit was being directed at Damian's new humanitarian vision, a vision Marcus knew had been planted there by Elara. He felt his own position, his decades of loyalty being eroded by this upstart waitress. He decided he needed leverage, something to sever the connection between them for good. He tasked his own private investigators, the same ruthless firm Blackwood Capital used for corporate espionage, to dig into every aspect of Elara Vance's life. He wasn't just looking for financial history or work records. He wanted something personal, something damaging. It took them less than a week. The report landed on Marcus's desk in a sealed black folder. As he read it, a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. It was better than he could have ever imagined. The connection wasn't just ideological, it was direct. Arthur Vance, the Phoenix Tower, Blackwood Capital. It was all there. She was the daughter of a man they had ruined. This was the perfect weapon. In his mind, the narrative was clear: she was a fraud. She had infiltrated the company under false pretenses, seeking revenge. She was manipulating Damian using his pet project to settle a family score. Once Damian saw this, he would be furious. The trust, the respect, it would all shatter. He would see her as a traitor, and he would crush her. Marcus scheduled a meeting for the following morning in the main boardroom. He requested the presence of Damian himself and Elara. The subject line of the invitation was intentionally vague. Project Phoenix, a review of historical precedents. He was ready to watch the world burn down around Elara Vance. He had no idea the fire would spread in a direction he could never have predicted. The boardroom felt colder than usual. A sense of finality hung in the air. Elara entered to find Damian already seated at the head of the long, polished table, and Marcus Thorne standing near the head, a thin black folder in his hands. His expression was one of barely contained triumph. "Thank you for joining us, Elara," Marcus said, his use of her first name a venomous familiarity. "Damian and I were just about to discuss some archival business that has recently come to my attention. I thought you, with your interest in architecture and family history, might find it illuminating." Elara's blood ran cold. She knew with sickening certainty what was in that folder. "Marcus, get to the point," Damian said, his voice betraying a deep-seated weariness. "Of course," Marcus said, opening the folder and placing a document in front of Damian. It was the executive summary of the Phoenix Tower acquisition. He then placed a second document beside it, a biography of Arthur Vance, complete with a photograph of him standing with a younger, smiling Elara. "It seems our esteemed consultant, Miss Vance, has a more personal connection to Blackwood Capital than she disclosed." Marcus began, his voice ringing with theatrical revelation. Her father was Arthur Vance, the lead architect and primary stakeholder of the Phoenix Tower project, a project which, as you'll recall, we acquired and liquidated 12 years ago, a very profitable venture for us. Not so much for Mr. Vance, who was financially and professionally ruined. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle in the room. He looked at Elara, expecting to see panic. Instead, he saw a profound, sorrowful calm. "She played you, Damian." Marcus pressed on, turning his attention to his boss. This whole act, the quiet dignity, the passion for the hospital, it's all been a charade. She's been using your money and your resources to build a monument to her failed father right under your nose. It's revenge, pure and simple. She's a viper you welcomed into your house. Damian said nothing. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at the documents. He looked at Elara, his grey eyes searching her face, trying to reconcile the woman he had come to respect with the traitor Marcus was painting. The silence stretched thick with tension. Elara's heart pounded, but she held his gaze. She would not defend herself. The work, the building itself, was her only defense. Finally, Damian moved. He slowly pushed the documents back towards Marcus. "You're right about one thing, Marcus," he said, his voice dangerously low. "It was a very profitable venture." He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. "I've liquidated hundreds of companies. I've stripped assets, crushed competitors, and ruined men for 1/10 of a percentage point on a quarterly report. It's what we do. It's how this tower was built. He turned back his gaze, sweeping over Marcus, and finally resting on Elara again. The Phoenix Tower. I remember it now. The idealist architect who didn't understand that the world doesn't run on good intentions. We crushed him because it was easy, because it was profitable. We never once considered the human cost, the broken dream the family left behind. We saw a name on a spreadsheet and we deleted it. He walked back to the table and picked up the photo of Elara and her father. He looked at it for a long moment. "You're fired, Marcus," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Marcus stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. "What, Damian? She's the one who... I know what she is." Damian cut him off, his voice rising with a long-suppressed anger. "She's the bill, Marcus. She's the reckoning for a decade of practiced indifference. She came in here and held up a mirror, and you're too blind to see anything but your own reflection." He threw the folder down on the table. "You think her work on this hospital is revenge, you fool? Revenge would have been a lawsuit. Revenge would have been selling a story to the press. This is redemption. She's been cleaning up our mess. She's been building something with a soul to make up for the fact that this company doesn't have one." He turned to Elara, and for the first time she saw the impenetrable walls of Damian Blackwood crumble. What lay beneath was not a monster, but a man profoundly weary of the empire he had built. "Your father was right," he said, his voice raw. "He was a visionary, and we were just vandals in expensive suits. I looked at his plans back then. They were brilliant, and we tore them down." He took a deep breath. "The Blackwood Pavilion is a monument to my ego. I see that now. I want it to be something more. I want it to be a monument to him, to Arthur Vance." He came around the table and stood before her. "I am not asking for your forgiveness. I haven't earned it. But I am asking you to stay. Don't finish this project for me. Finish it for him. You will have full autonomy, unlimited budget, the final word on everything. Just show me how to build something that lasts." Tears that Elara had refused to shed for months finally traced a path down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness or anger, but of a complex, cathartic release. In the heart of her enemy, in the cold citadel of corporate greed, she had found the one thing she never expected: a conscience. She looked at the man who had destroyed her past, and in his eyes she saw the unexpected flickering hope for a better future. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll stay." In the end, the story wasn't about spilled wine. It was about what rises from the ruins. Elara Vance never got her old life back, but she built a new one, not as a victim, but as a creator. The Arthur Vance Pavilion at St. Jude's became a marvel of compassionate design, a place where sunlight and hope were as vital as medicine. It stood as a testament to her father's vision and her own unbreakable spirit. Damian Blackwood never became a saint, but he was no longer just a predator. He had been shown the true cost of his success and began the long, difficult process of finding purpose beyond profit, forever changed by the waitress who couldn't be bought. Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound changes don't come from grand battles, but from a quiet, unwavering refusal to lose one's dignity. It shows us that one person armed with integrity can force an empire to look in the mirror and question its own reflection. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of unexpected heroes and unforgettable transformations. Thank you for listening.